Hey everybody. Today we are going to wrap up the unit on the federal courts and focus specifically on the Supreme Court, primarily how the Supreme Court goes about actually making its rulings, determining what the Constitution effectively means. We're going to look at both the process for like the step-by-step process for how they do that, along with the actual different models that judges use when it comes to evaluating the Constitution. So let's dive in. Welcome back. This is our current Supreme Court. This guy right here is the Chief Justice. That is John Roberts. He is in charge. The Chief Justice is usually called the first among equals. He doesn't have any additional powers, but they're the ones that kind of run the show. Everybody else are called associate justices. So put them together, their powers combined, they are the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. Remember, you're a judge, but when you are on the Supreme Court, you are a justice. So again, these guys are appointed for life. They can retire. It's not a life sentence, but it is very, 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 very prestigious. Definitely the top thing that you can do in terms of being a lawyer or a judge. The way you actually become a Supreme Court justice is you are picked or nominated by the president, and then you need to be confirmed by the Senate. It becomes a little bit controversial because different presidents have different philosophies in terms of what they want their justices to do, and they have different positions. We're not going to get into that because that's a whole other rabbit hole, but it is a very, 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 very important thing that the president does. And sometimes these have become very controversial. Justice Kavanaugh, you may remember from last year, that became a whole thing based off of a number of different factors. But it's important to keep in mind that the Supreme Court is not meant to be political. I'll say that again. It is not meant to be a political branch of the government. The reason that they serve for life is we don't ever want to have judges where they are like running for reelection, or where maybe you believe that you should make this ruling based off of your interpretation of the Constitution. But if you had to run for reelection, you would have to think about how the people would react to that. And then you would maybe be making decisions not based off of the merits of the case, but instead based off of popular opinion. So the reason it's set up this way is so that judges can not worry about that so much. And by the way, some states do actually elect judges in the state courts, and it absolutely does become political. So I would argue that this is actually a very good feature of our constitutional system. Now, it's important to keep in mind the actual what they do, what federal judges do, and that's just to make sure that the laws are interpreted correctly, that justice is performed in the court proceedings, and especially with the Supreme Court right here, to interpret what the Constitution actually means. And most of the time, with most cases, it's not that complicated or controversial, but sometimes big cases do make their way up to the Supreme Court, which we're going to be talking about now. So it's important to keep in mind that the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. It's the court of last resort, and it's the last step. Let me change my color there. It's the last step along the way. So by the time the Supreme Court actually hears a case, it's already been tried or heard by 2 separate courts, 99% of the time. So they are hearing appeals, and when they get a case, it's already been heard a number of times already. So in terms of how the Supreme Court goes about doing its job, the first thing they need to do is to determine the cases that they are going to hear. So individuals who lose their case on appeals, they can appeal their case to the Supreme Court. Now, here's the deal. Just because you appeal a case to the Supreme Court does not mean that they have to hear it. In fact, they only end up hearing about 100 cases a year. So what they do is the justices and their assistants, they look at all of the appeals that are sent in, and they're going to look for if there's any sort of area of controversy, or if there's some sort of interpretation that they really need to render, or if you have 2 separate courts that are making 2 different decisions, and they need to kind of get them on the same page. But they actually decide, and they eventually vote. The individual justices vote on which cases to hear. And if 4 of the 9 justices want to hear the case, then you actually hear the case. At that point, they issue what's called a writ of certiorari, which I know I am mispronouncing, which is effectively just a document that says, okay, we're going to hear your case. So if you are appealing a case to the Supreme Court, you are writing them, you are asking for a writ of certiorari, and if they decide to hear your case, they will grant the writ of certiorari, which again means we are going to hear your case, so get ready for that. Here is the Supreme Court chamber itself. This photo was taken after the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. That's why it's kind of draped in black right now. There are actually almost never any pictures allowed in the Supreme Court chamber itself. 9 justices all sit right here, and then the people make their case right there, the different lawyers for the different sides. Each justice has 3 to 4 law clerks, which actually help them to do research and help them to deliberate. We'll kind of stop there for now. So the way that the actual cases are decided, and this is actually quite fascinating, and is very, very, very different than any trial that happens anywhere else in the country that I'm aware of. When a case is held before the Supreme Court, keep in mind the justices, they have already read the appeals. They have already read the arguments. So you're going to have both sides, and they're going to go before the court and argue one perspective and then the other. And they have usually 1/2 hour to effectively just make their case for why their side is right and the other side is wrong. So they're going to go before the bench that you saw, and they're going to start talking. And they always begin each argument the same exact way. They will say, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, and then they start making their argument. But what makes this actually quite a bit different is the justices are not quiet. They don't just listen to the argument. What happens is instead, all 9 of them, one at a time, they will begin to ask questions. They will begin to critique the lawyer to say, hey, did you think about this? But what about this? They will actually interrogate the lawyer for that side. They'll get 1/2 hour, then they're done. They are usually cut off by the Chief Justice, saying, thank you very much, have a seat, and then the other side goes. So it is not, so they may have a 1/2 hour presentation, the lawyer may have a 1/2 hour presentation, but they're not going to make it through it because they are going to be asked questions by the actual justices who have already done the research, and they're maybe trying to get an answer to a particular issue that they're having with the case. So it's very, very, very different. You're not going to make it through your presentation. The lawyers are going to be spending most of their time just responding to the questions from the judges. Here we see an example. Again, there's no cameras allowed in the Supreme Court chamber. Here's one. You can draw pictures though. Here's one of the lawyers making their case, and again, they get asked the questions. Chief Justice sits in the middle, and then it's kind of left to right based off of seniority. The newer members are off to the sides. The people who have been there longer are in the middle. After the case has been argued, they go to effectively kind of a secret conference, and the judges decide how they are going to vote, and they try to persuade one another. It's not like a jury. You do not need a unanimous decision. So when the justices are making a ruling, there are 9 justices. Whoever has the majority opinion wins. So it may be a 5-4 decision when the Supreme Court makes its ruling. And frequently that is what happens. You will have 5-4 decisions, or it's actually kind of common to have unanimous 9-0 opinions. And when the justices are making their constitutional interpretations, they rely on this term right here, which is called stare decisis, meaning the rule of precedent. So what that means is when the Supreme Court is making their judicial interpretations, they are basing their decisions off of what previous courts have said. So in American legal tradition, you rely on the example of previous courts. So if the Supreme Court said in 1860 that you need a search warrant to go through my house, then every court after that generally has to obey that decision. So whatever the issue is, you guys read about flag burning in one of the previous assignments. Well, the Supreme Court ruled in the 1980s that flag burning is constitutionally protected as free speech. Meaning, once they make that ruling, every other court in the country has to obey that ruling. Furthermore, if there was another case that got brought up to the Supreme Court that dealt with that same issue, the Supreme Court would, in all likelihood, rely on that earlier example. They are very, very, very reluctant to change any previous court decision. And normally they only do that when there is an egregious issue or something that they clearly got wrong. But by and large, they go on what the other courts have said. So they vote. The majority opinion will write their majority opinion, their argument for here's what we're saying, here's why we're right. And then the justices for the losing side can actually write what's called a dissenting opinion, where they object and they say why they are right. The opinions are later, usually at the end of each term. The Supreme Court has 2 terms, one in the fall and one in the spring. They generally release their opinions at the end of the term, so in December and also in June, but they can release them at any time. And they actually just changed this. They started recently posting them online, but before they only used to print them out. So the different news networks would actually have aides take the court decision and run it out so they could read it very quickly. Kind of amusing. Although again, they actually just stopped doing this, which makes me sad. Okay, so in closing out, we're actually going to focus on how, if you are a judge on the federal court, and especially a Supreme Court justice, how you actually make your decision. So how do you decide what the Constitution actually says? And I will tell you, the issues that they get are much more complicated. The Constitution can be a pretty simple document. How many senators does each state have? Well, that's obvious. It just says 2. There's no wiggle room. There's no room for interpretation. But in some other issues, they actually have to do some clear interpretation. So, I have a 4th Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Well, if a police officer stops me and frisks me and then find that I'm carrying a weapon and arrest me on that ground, is that a violation of my 4th Amendment rights? It's those types of decisions that they have to make. And there's different ways that they actually approach deciding what the Constitution actually says. The first 2 models, which the state of Virginia wants me to hit on, is activism versus restraint. I don't like these terms as much, but I'm paid by Virginia. So judicial activists, they are people who are accused of using the courts to kind of further some sort of societal norm, or to actually make sweeping decisions that have reverberations throughout society. So, for example, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, people said that was a judicial activist role when that came out. Judicial restraint is where judges are reluctant to make big sweeping decisions, and they want to be a little bit more laid back and leave that to the Congress and the presidency. Those are 2 approaches. I prefer a different model. I'm going to skip this right now. And this is the model that I want you to focus on, and this is what your reading actually deals with. The 2 separate ways to interpret the Constitution, and this is very simplistic, but you can effectively categorize most judges within one of these 2 camps. You have the originalist model, which tends to be more Republican, and then you have what I call the adaptive model, which tends to be more liberal. If you are an originalist judge, what you ask yourself is, when they wrote the Constitution, what was the meaning of the text? And you would argue that the Constitution can't change over time unless you amend it or do something to actually change it, and that the Constitution is a static document that does not evolve, does not change, does not grow, right? So you guys read about flag burning. When the Constitution was written, the people who wrote the Constitution and wrote the First Amendment would have been fine with a law banning flag burning, right? They would say that, courts can make that law, you don't have the freedom to burn a flag. Well, and originals would say that, if you want to outlaw flag burning, or if you want to make it legal, they can pass laws, but you can't just change the meaning of the Constitution. It just stays as it was when the Constitution was written or whenever that amendment was introduced. So it's a fixed meaning. The Constitution does not change over time. The adaptive model, which a lot of Democrats subscribe to, is where you can't just change the meaning of the Constitution, but they would say that our ideas do change over time, and that in some ways the Constitution does kind of evolve and updates when it comes to new standards of morality or new understandings of freedom or basic rights. So these people tend to be more okay with the court, making whatever new decision that they may have. So again, originalist, Constitution does not change over time, meaning does not change, does not evolve. The adaptive model says that the Constitution kind of is updated based off of our interpretation. The example I'm going to have you look at in the reading deals with like the death penalty, for example, and I think that reading will probably do a better job. For example, take the Eighth Amendment, which you're going to deal with in the reading, says no cruel or unusual punishment, right? Well, back in the day, they would be perfectly fine with having a hanging on the courthouse lawn, for example, for someone who is convicted of murder. Well, today, I don't think there's anyone in the country who would argue that that would be a good idea or that would be constitutional. The Eighth Amendment protects against cruel or unusual punishment. If you believe that it's cruel and unusual to hang someone publicly on the courthouse lawn, then you are using an adaptive model, because that was not how it was originally interpreted. Back in 1790, they would be probably okay with a public hanging as the means of the death penalty. So, and originals would say, well, if it was okay in 1790, then it must be okay today because we have not amended the Constitution to change it. So that's just one example. In the reading, we'll have another one of those.